answer your questions. Just to get you started, we thought we'd give you a little quick overview of a few important sections of publishing very fast. What we'd like you to do when we're giving our quick little chats is to maybe come up with some questions, if there's some things that you really want to know, and then ask us, and we'll use those to kind of have the conversation running. Because again, this is for you to ask questions and to get answers for things that we might not know that you want to know. So yeah, we'll quickly introduce ourselves. Because I have the mic and I'm louder at the moment, I'll start. So I'm Tessa Durrell. I work as a publisher for Elsevier. I work as a publisher for 12 journals in geochemistry and planetary sciences. And what that entails basically is I hire editors and work on how the journal runs in general. But I'm also very happy to answer questions about how to publish, how to become an editor, how to review, anything publishing related basically. But here are some other publishing related colleagues, so please introduce yourself.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Joel Bloom, and I'm a professor of geochemistry at the University of Michigan. I've been the editor-in-chief of a number of different journals over my career, and currently I'm the editor of the American Chemical Society Journal of Earth and Space Chemistry, which is about 3 years old. And I'm going to talk in a minute, but I'll pass the mic in a moment.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Geo Filippelli. I'm a professor of Earth Sciences at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, the most awkward university name ever. I'm the editor-in-chief of the American Geophysical Union Journal, Geo Health, and I'll be presenting it.
Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca Neely, and I think unlike everyone else on this panel, I am a professional editor, so I'm no longer working in research, and I work for Nature Geoscience.
Hi, I'm Liana Benning. I'm from the German Research Center for Geosciences, and I'm an academic. I do research, but I'm also editor for the EAG's 2 journals, GPL, Geochemical Perspectives and Geochemical Perspectives Letters. So this is a society kind of journals.
Okay. Do you care?
Okay, so we kind of drew straws to see who would talk about each of these different 5 categories, and I was the last to get to the email. So I got the first one on tips for preparing your manuscripts. So what I'd like you to do is just, I'm going to go through these very quickly, but because we want to leave lots of time for questions. So if there are things that you'd like us to go into in more detail, just let us know. I feel like this is something I'm an expert in because I've published over 250 papers. And I need to see the slides. Okay, so obviously well, maybe not so obviously. The first thing that I believe you should really do is to create a really useful outline of your research. So gather your data, determine the major advances that emerge from the study that you carried out, carefully organize the data, and then a key is to sketch potential figures that may appear in the text of your article. I then have my students write a simple text explaining the draft figures, and we get those out to collaborators and review the outline with colleagues to make sure that everything is in order. So the take-home, the tip 1 is to start outlines early in your project and share them early with your collaborators and other colleagues. The second tip is choose the journal carefully, and looking at the scope of the different journals that you may be considering, the length of papers that they'll publish, what the likely readership is, whether they're a profit or non-profit journal, if that makes a difference to you, and then whether they're open access versus subscription funding models, which are all significant differences that a lot of times students are not aware of until they publish a few papers. The third is read and follow the guidelines for the journal. It kind of goes without saying, but each journal has very detailed, very specific guidelines, and things will go much more smoothly if you follow them very carefully. Tip number 4, tell a story. Make sure that the paper has a main theme and a punchline. Provide context to the prior literature and cite the original work as opposed to secondary references whenever possible. Make sure you explain why your work is important. Share experimental data details to the point where other competitors of yours could have enough information that they could repeat the experiments. And then analyze the data accurately and objectively, providing a strong conclusion and describing how your work moves the field forward. The main anatomy of a manuscript, again, don't have to go into detail here, but I think the point I want to make is that you don't necessarily go in a linear order. That a lot of people start out by writing the experimental section, some people start out by writing the abstract. Doesn't really matter. It works differently, better for different people. I'm one who always starts with the experimental section. Okay, tip 5, really put the time and effort into your graphics. Sometimes you'll have a graphic you've used in another talk or something, and just the hassle of going and starting over to really make it appropriate seems daunting, but it's always worthwhile. You want clear, precise graphics, simple but informative, complementing the text and supporting your story. And when in doubt, use color to make it clear and make graphs that are original, unpublished artwork. Okay. Avoid common language pitfalls. People tend to use imprecise language, which a lot of reviewers don't like. So the imprecise language in the translation, so you don't want to say it's been known. That means I did not look up the reference. Don't say in my experience, because that means I've seen this once before. Don't say in many cases, because this only means that you've seen it twice before. Or in a series of cases, you've seen it 3 times. Or saying it is believe that really means that that's just what you think, but you haven't substantiated. And avoid the term like it is generally believed that, which means a couple of other people think so too.
And sorry, just one thing. We
Sure.
are scientists. We don't believe.
Right. Very good. Number 6, attract readers with a strong title. You want a compelling title describing your results and findings in as few words as possible. Avoid buzzwords and hard to justify claims like first and only. And avoid asking a question in the title, being really clear instead of what you've accomplished in your paper. Some journals now have table of contents graphics. Make sure those capture the reader's attentions and give a good impression of what the paper's about. And then revise, edit, and rework. You need lots of eyes on your paper, and don't be shy about getting help from your colleagues. Consider sharing your draft with all members of your team working on the project, your supervisor, other lab mates or colleagues. Sometimes a knowledgeable scientist who doesn't know the details of your work. Just make sure that your writing is clear and understandable. And I just want to point out that a lot of people think that just a couple of drafts and they're going to be ready to submit their paper. Some of my students' papers have been edited thoroughly as many as 15 times before submission. So don't be surprised if you go around and around and around with your colleagues before you get it the best possible paper. Take the supplemental information section seriously, and there are a number of journals now that are actually specifically asking reviewers to comment on the quality of the SI sections. And then finally, write a strong cover letter. Address the editor-in-chief or associate editor directly, include the title of the manuscript and mention the journal that you're submitting to. Highlight the relevance of your work and explain why it's appropriate for the journal that you're submitting to. Provide a list of preferred reviewers. This isn't true for all journals, but for many journals, they want a list of preferred reviewers who have the appropriate expertise, who don't have a conflict of interest, who you think could provide a critical and knowledgeable review. And then make sure that you check the submission checklist for the journal that you're submitting to, so that you have everything laid out before you sign on to the website to do the submission. And that's all I have. Thank you very much for your attention. A question?
Yeah, so I just published a paper.
Could you stand up, please?
I just published a paper and found that I wound up sticking a lot of my experimental details in the SI. How do you approach towards all those little details that actually make it so much
So you're saying how, I mean, it's okay, I mean, you want those details in the SI, but I think the thing is that when in doubt, put in the details so that others, know, very specifically what, the experimental conditions, equipment used, et cetera. I'm not sure I'm answering your question though.
Yeah, I guess I just really struggled with figuring out where to put it. How to, I guess.
Oh, so what should go in the SI versus what should go?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So my view is that you want enough detail in the paper that, not that you could reproduce the experiments, but that an expert knows specifically what you did. That there's enough information that you can review in a knowledgeable way. Having enough detail that someone who's very familiar with that area would know exactly what you did. Whereas the SI is going to bring in a lot of details that are important if you wanted to repeat the experiment, but are not necessary to understand the context of the experiments that you did. I don't know if somebody else wants to add to that.
I think you have to think about the fact that if somebody who's not a specialist reads your paper, not the SI, they have to understand generically what you've been doing and judge whether that's done correctly. But if they want to know the details, and like you said, want to reproduce it, you have to have enough information in the SI for people to actually look at that and be able to reproduce every single step. And as a reviewer, you have to look at both. You have to actually also evaluate the SI and say, well, is this what is said in detail commensurate with the data which comes out later? But as a, let me say, non-nerd, you need to read the main methods and understand them. And then as the nerd, you need to read the main methods and understand them, and then go to the SI and see the nerdy things, which have to be correct as well.
Cool, I have lots of time for questions as well. That was a really good one. Thank you for starting with a juicy question. We just noticed there's a bunch of extra lunches at the back, so if you haven't grabbed your lunch, make sure you get it. It's lunchtime. So what I thought would be useful is, one side you have, of course, writing the paper, but of course most papers that you see have multiple authors on them. They've got lots of people in the acknowledgements and all sorts of things. What do these people do? And especially that hurdle of getting your first paper with you as the first author, it sort of falls into ethics, which is why it says ethics on this slide, but not entirely. So I thought that would be a useful thing. I've got lots of slides. I'm going to go through them quite quickly because I don't want to give a full presentation. But yeah, just to give you a little bit of idea, what does an author actually need to do other than write the paper, which is pretty hopefully obvious. So this is just a disclaimer saying that always follow the journal guidelines. So who's responsible for ethics in a paper? And so this is one thing that you might not think about as an author that you're actually responsible for, but you are responsible for this, for making sure the information is correct. Everyone who should be on the paper is there, that what you're doing is ethical. So it's partially your responsibility as the first author, especially to keep track of this, but it's also all the other stakeholders in the process as well, including publishers like myself. Your institute is also responsible for the ethics in your paper. This also means that if you do something in your paper that's not allowed, your institute will generally be notified about it because it's partially their responsibility as well. So what does it mean to be an author? I'll stick on this slide a little bit, just to have think about this. So you've made the most, as usually as the first author, you've made the most substantial intellectual contribution to the paper. This can be writing the whole paper, this can be providing all of the data, this can be providing the entire idea. But so it's up to you with your team to decide who is the person that should go first. In some teams I know people say that the PI goes as first author. This is sort of not really the practice that we like anymore. So certainly if you feel that you should be the first author, there's a case to be made for that. But it's something you should agree at the beginning when you're making your outline for your paper, as we just heard, is also consider what order the author is going to go in and where will you fit into that process. So here's just a little thing of do's and don'ts that we see a lot. So you definitely, again, like I said, you want to have your first author set, whether that's you or somebody who's researching with you, and your co-authors and what order they're happy to go in. The don'ts are probably more important here. One of them is ghost authors. So when someone has contributed to your paper but doesn't want to be on the list for some reason, or you leave them off for some reason, that's what's sort of known as a ghost author, and it's leaving somebody who did actually make a substantial contribution to your work. You haven't included them. Now there's some debate about whether you can include people as a co-author or in your acknowledgements, but if somebody contributed to the paper, they should be either a co-author or in the acknowledgements somewhere. And the other thing that we see that's a really bad idea is to gift somebody an authorship in your paper. Some people will ask for this, sometimes you'll be asked to give it. to, you know, senior researchers. If someone's on your paper, they should have contributed to it in some way. Again, it's your work, so why would you give credit to somebody who hasn't actually helped on that work? Because it's also just unfair to your co-authors in that case. So those are really important things when you're looking at how to structure who's going to be on your paper, and if they go as a co-author or in your acknowledgements, or if they might be the first author. Just to the final thought on that, authorship disputes. This is something that, as a publisher, you do see quite a bit of as well, and we tend to send that back to the group saying, you have to decide who the authorship is of this paper, because as a publisher, or even as an editor, you can't decide that. So again, early on in your paper, have a good look, have a discussion with your team, who gets to be on this paper, in what order, why, or people where they are. Because it's something that's difficult to help with once the paper is either published or on its way to publication. It's very difficult for the outside world to know why you did what you did. So have a thought, think about that in the beginning. If you do come up with a paper that you feel you should have been an author on, of course, editors can try to help you if you can make a strong case for it, if you can demonstrate that you did actually make a contribution to the paper. But in general, we advise you to start, if you see, you know, a paper by one of your co-workers that should have had your name on it, start with contacting that person and work it out. Because papers can be changed after they're published. We can put a core addendum to add your name and things, but it's something that, again, it starts with you and your immediate colleagues with getting you onto papers that you feel you should have been on. And this is just a thing as well that some journals have started requesting, is an actual listing of who did what on the paper. It helps just the wider world to know why are you in that particular order and what have you done. And this might be especially useful for you as well as junior researchers or younger researchers, that if you want to say, you might not have been the first author on a paper, but you'd like to demonstrate to a hiring committee, I contributed hugely to this paper. It's really useful to have this because you can show exactly where you fit into the scheme of things. That's a very brief recap. But so again, with authorship, just the main thing, really decided at the beginning. It's so much easier and it avoids lots of disputes. And people who contributed to the paper are on it. People who didn't contribute in any way shouldn't be on the paper. Another thing that comes up with conflicts of interest, and I don't know how much this is relevant to all of you, but of course some people, when you're doing your research, your PhD or your postdoc, you come up with some kind of company that works on your same work, or you find some way to monetize it, or you become employed by a company that works on something relevant to your research. You are allowed to publish in fields where you're gaining something from it, usually monetarily. It's allowed. The main thing here is to be clear about it and don't hide it. If you are, for instance, you know, the simple one is if you are a programmer and you happen to work for Google, tell people that when you're writing your paper. Because it is allowed, it's make sure it's open and clear and fair that everybody knows you have a chance to gain financially from this as well. So conflicts of interest, they really are in lots of different forms, but it's pretty basic. I mean, just be clear about what you're doing and what your relationship is to the field. These are issues to avoid, and these certainly as one of the authors are definitely something that you should be very aware of and you are responsible for. It's not just kind of assuming that your co-authors do it. Have a quick look at this. Make sure that is the research data real for one thing. Especially if you're working in a team, have a look at all the data. Make sure you know where it came from, that you can explain where it came from and understand where it came from. If you know that there's something in there that's false, that's something, again, to discuss in the group, or something that's incorrect, or something that needs to be updated. And the final thing is plagiarism. And plagiarism is probably one of the main things that we see as publishers, certainly as problems with articles. Whether it's a copied figure, a copied section of text, even a major concept. If you've reworded the entire thing, or one of your colleagues has reworded a paper of somebody else's, but it's not credited, that's still considered plagiarism. So it's something to be careful of. It's also something that's easy to be accused of. So you really want to make sure that if somebody would ever come to you and saying this has been copied, that you can demonstrate that it's not, and make sure it's your work. And the key way to avoid ever being accused of this is citing things. If you've gotten something from an idea, a concept, a color, a shade, anything, cite it, say where you got it from, because it can also help your fellow researchers to find it. And then, of course, I imagine, especially if you're working in a group, there's often multiple papers that will come out of your research, or multiple publications in various forms. Multiple submissions, again, you can submit different papers to different journals at the same time. You can't submit the same paper to different journals at the same time. If you submit it to one journal and it spends a long time in review there, you'll first need to wait for that review process to finish before moving on to the next if it's not accepted. The same thing for cutting up your research in lots of little tiny papers and throwing them all over the place. That's called salami slicing. And the problem with that is often somebody who's asked to review your work, they will be asked to review lots of your work, even in different journals. So if somebody is asked to review something for Journal A that comes from you, and for Journal B, and it's a very similar topic, and they notice that tiny little bits of the same project, that's really, really frowned upon, and can end up having both of your papers rejected. So if your paper belongs as a unit, publish it as a unit. So here again, just a short recap. Again, have a look at the data. Just check. It's not that you're checking over someone's shoulder, but make sure you know what you're publishing as well. Your name's going on it. It's original. You should be on the authorship. Any conflicts of interest, any ways that you think people could possibly think this is unfair, just state it. Just be clear about it. And then submitting to one journal at a time and submitting a whole article to one journal at a time. So those are the responsibilities, and that goes a little bit beyond just writing the paper. It goes looking at the entire process of publishing the paper as well, making sure you're being clear about anything. And if you're ever unclear about, should I be stating this, should I be writing this, you're always very welcome to contact the editors or the publishers. There's usually lots of information about this online. Again, everyone's happy to read your work. They just want to know exactly who you are and how the work came to be. And that's part of the responsibilities of being an author. Any questions? Yes?
I had a question about, self-plagiarism.
Sorry, could you stand up so that people can hear your question?
So if you had published a bunch of your data in, let's say, a conference publication, that sort of thing, and then you're writing a paper to a journal, could you use a good deal of that in a different format?
I mean, the way that I always looked at that is you can reuse the words or reuse the text or reuse the ideas, but cite yourself. If you published it before, why wouldn't you give yourself a citation? And that's the safest way. If you're ever worried about, I've published this before and I think it's going to come up that it looks like I've plagiarized myself, cite it, and then you can explain why you're reusing it. That citation will also give you a chance to say, I published this before and I'm restating it because of these reasons. Again, it's just about being clear and showing that you're not salami slicing, that look, I've put this out there before, but I'm using it again for these purposes. So I think that's also a really good one to have. Anything else?
Just a quick question. So if one of the, collaborators only involved really in the editing part of the manuscript, are they still considered a co-author, or do they go into acknowledgement?
This is a really good question as well, of what the limits are for somebody who's an author versus someone who goes in the acknowledgements. And it's something that really is up to you and your team to decide. Authorship, agreements as well, any changes that are made are normally agreed by the entire team. Certainly if it ever comes down to contacting the publisher about changing authorship, we always have to have the agreement of every single author on the paper. So that's something that you should discuss as a group. And then if multiple people in the group feel that person should be an author, if they've contributed substantially to the work, that's really just a group decision. And it's difficult to draw a straight line because in some cases, as you can imagine, there's lots of contribution to it, whether it's language editing or whether it's conceptual editing. But normally for authorship, it means somebody who contributed intellectually to the paper, not just editing very basic language or image layout or something. But it certainly should be agreed with your entire authorship group.
But I would say if the editing by somebody who has not been contributing to the idea or the research fundamentally changes the paper because it changes the way the story is sold, that's an intellectual contribution. But in some countries, they also know that basically English editing or language editing is also part of the intellectual contribution. So I think it's a very fine balance where you draw that line, but it's the whole team has to agree, not just random. Like I think what you were saying very clearly is like, don't just put people on because they sit next door to the next office. And you talk to them once about your problem.
I just wanted to, to add a comment about submitting manuscripts to other journals, and just to suggest that if you're submitting, say, to Nature Geoscience, and you have another paper that is directly relevant somehow to the paper you're submitting to me, you should let me know as an editor that paper, where it's submitted and where it is in the process, and ideally send me a copy. So then we can evaluate the paper you have with us next to that paper and the contributions they make. So just be really clear up front, because otherwise you get into a situation potentially where I'm going to accept your paper, and then I see this other paper's being published, and now I have to reevaluate what contribution your paper makes in contrast to that paper that's already been published. So just be very clear up front, which I think is basically the message all the way through. Be very clear.
I was just going to ask a follow-up question about the plagiarism, or as preprints become more common, how do you encourage people to show that they have a preprint somewhere, or that that's not seen as plagiarism.
Could you explain preprint first?
Sure. So a preprint, at least in the way that I view it, and I'm assuming that's the way you view it, is the work that you've written, but it hasn't been edited yet, or it hasn't been peer reviewed yet. So it's your ideas written out, possibly in paper format, sometimes in different formats, and then you publish it online on things like Archive or SSRN or different preprint servers. But the general idea is that it has not been edited or been through a review process yet. So I know that for our journals we allow them, so this is one thing that you want to check. If you know that you want to submit your paper to a particular journal, check if they allow preprints. Most journals do, but it's a good thing just to know beforehand. So we normally tell our editors that if somebody would like to post a preprint of their unedited article, just their complete raw submitted version, they would like to put that online, that's very welcome and actually encouraged because it gives you some early comments or early chance to share your work. I think just like Rebecca said as well, it's worth stating it. If you've posted your stuff online somewhere and the editor's curious about that, just put it in your cover letter saying, I posted this as a preprint to X, Y, and Z. Again, it just helps the editors know what they're looking at. So yeah, so generally they're allowed, they're encouraged even, because again, it's all about sharing your work. Just be clear about what you've done and be clear about where your work is.
Sorry to add on to that. I'm not very familiar with preprints, but can you just take the same exact text, or does it have to be the idea but written differently?
So certainly if you're submitting it for the first time, it can be the same text. The actual text is fine because it's your text, you've written it, so you can post what you like. There's also been some questions in a previous talk about what to do after your paper's been published. How can you share it? So in my cases, for most of the journals I work on, this called an embargo period, and after that period, the text and the images, again, check with the individual journal that you use, but normally the text and the images, you can reuse those if you want to post them on a post-print sharing site, or for instance in your university repository. That's another way to get your paper noticed, get your paper read. Usually you can't post the final version as in the PDF that you get from that actual journal, but certainly sharing the ideas and the text and then pointing people to where your article is published is a really good idea and gets your stuff out there and gets it seen. Yeah?
I have a question related to the multiple kind of paper.
Get up, Lisa. Maybe repeat the question.
It's a question related to multiple paper. So if you have a paper accepted and published and you then want to send in another paper that is related, do you then have to state that you've got this published paper, or will the editor know that?
I would say that in general, I would already know that, or I would find that. So I wouldn't request you to send me your entire publication record when you're submitting a paper to me as an editor. So yeah, if it's already accepted, it's already out there, then I can find it as an editor. It's these papers that are partially way through. And sometimes we might find them if you post them onto a server. But other than that, we have no idea that they're in the process, especially if they're with another publishing house or journal.
Questions. So my first question is regarding self-plagiarism. I have a feeling I'm going to be writing the exact same introductory paragraph for every publication I make. How much do I need to change that between different papers?
Some of the academics here
So,
answer that.
yeah, so the best practice is to rewrite it and not to use the same words. And just to be warned, there are many journals now that run software that basically looks for repeated words, and so that will pop up in the process, and the editor will know. And there are many reviewers who will be put off by that. So by far, although some journals may let you do it, I think the best practice is to rewrite it. And you just have to don't read the first one for a few months and just sit down and let it come right out of your brain. It's the only way to don't pollute your mind with your own writing.
I had a student once who said, but it's written so beautifully, I can't do it better. And I said, yes, but that's their writing, not yours. So I think the ultimate thing, if I review a paper and I recognize my writing in somebody's methods or something like that, now that pisses me off. Because that's called plagiarism, even though you consider it self-plagiarism, but it's maybe the third or fourth paper which has been plagiarized. And indeed, there are certain parts of the method or certain parts of the story which can only be said one way if you want to make it short, but it has to be your way, not somebody else's way.
I would just add that I think another area for this that people really struggle with is the methods section. So if you're doing a very standard, so for instance, I do molybdenum isotopes, and there's really only so many ways you can describe your methods. We do have plagiarism checks, and we will see that, and it's kind of an editorial judgment at that point as to if we think it's appropriate or not, and are you citing it properly. We would always encourage you to try and rewrite it, but at the same time, if you are rewriting it to the extent that your methods no longer make sense, that's the problem. So there's a judgment call to be made.
And I think the fewest people judge you very harshly when you, in the very dry method section, you repeat certain statements, because you can only say that often that by doing X-ray diffraction we did it this way. There's not much else you can say. But if in the other sections you also see repeated parts, or full paragraphs from your methods are copied and pasted, that's not just laziness, that's condescending.
And just one other comment about the methods is that luckily you can refer back to, the first paper you write on the method you can write in great detail, and then in subsequent papers you don't have to repeat it all because you can refer back to your previous paper and you can say that the methods were according to so-and-so, and then only discuss the changes, or, the differences that you made. So you don't often get stuck in that situation.
Second question I have is, what if you wind up with just like an absolute beast of a paper? Like it's super long and the editor looks at it and says, this is too long. Like, can you split it up? Like, what do you do at that point?
Well, I'll just say briefly and I'll pass the microphone, but two options. One is if there are two stories to be told, sometimes it can be two, but you don't want to arbitrarily break it up. But the wonderful thing are the SI sections. Is basically you can move large portions of the paper into the SI, which makes your paper much more readable. And my experience is that it will probably be reviewed a lot more favorably too, because reviewers, they get tired and they get cranky when they're long papers, and so you're better off with shorter and to move as much material into the SI as you can. Yeah.
I'm a computational chemist, but I've done a little bit of lab work, but not a lot. I would like to incorporate that bit of extra work into my paper. What would be the best proportion, or how much do I mention something that is not my major work?
This might sound harsh, and I'm willing to have other views from the panel, but I would say, from my point of view as an editor, especially in Geoscience, we have very short papers, so I think having a clear message and having the data that is pertinent to that message. And I remember when I was first starting my PhD, I was incredibly frustrated that, for instance, I couldn't include all of the things that had gone wrong and didn't work, because I spent so much of my time on failed things. And it felt really unfair that that wasn't somehow credited in the paper system. But I think you really have to remember that the aim of writing a paper is that people are going to use your data and your ideas. So I would only include it if it's adding something to that story. If it's just because you want to demonstrate that you've done it, that's not the right motivation. So it should be adding something. So if it's adding and supporting and really bolstering up your conclusions, include it. If it's just to kind of show that you've done it, I would be cautious about including it.
I have a question about tables. So for my master's thesis, I published it a few months afterwards, and I had a lot of data. And my master's supervisor told me that I should put it into a paper. And I was thinking, okay, maybe the editor will come back and say, no, this has to go into supplementary information, but it didn't. It went on for 11 pages. So I was wondering, at what point is it useless or senseless to put so much data into a paper, even if the editor doesn't agree?
I think that's totally dependent on the journal you're submitting it on. Because in journals which have a limited number of words, obviously you can't put it in an 11-page paper, but in journals where that's perfectly acceptable, that's fine. I mean, I think it's always think about the readership and what the readership wants from your data and what you want to say. But I think the more data is published, the better, because that means it's something which can or cannot be reproduced at a later stage. It's better than not publishing it, but whether you put it in the mains or in the SI, it really depends on the...
Excellent. I might add, I think Joel made this point. Your papers are to tell a story, right? Your data backbones that story. But that rarely are journalists or whoever going to be excited to tell about your story and describe your 11 pages of table. So, I mean, I agree if it's allowed in the journal article, and there's no, some of them don't have supplementary SIs, in which case that's the only place it can go, and in fact it should go. But otherwise, I pretty much always dump those to SI, only because the people super interested and the reviewers will have to read it anyway.
I can just add a little, there's a middle of the road kind of way to do it as well. If you're going to include it in the paper but not in the paper or in the SI, is to put it on a data repository in a format that somebody can use. I mean, sometimes we see tables as well that go on as an SI, but it's basically like a printed PDF that somebody will have to copy all those figures out into a new table and figure it out. So if there is a repository that's frequently used in your field, and you can put your data on there in a usable format, I mean, go ahead and use that. That's really useful. The next person who wants to come by and use it sees, okay, it's your data, you'll get the citation for it. You can also, in your paper, then saying data available here, and just put a nice little link that someone will click on. Again, 99% of people will read your paper online nowadays, so even if they open the PDF, they can click on the link, get all the data in a usable format. And that would be a kind of an elegant middle ground of it, still including it in a usable way, but not having 11 pages of table printed in your pages.
Could you, why does somebody point out the fact that the data repository now are required for 11?
Yeah, that is true. A lot of journals require data repositories, or at least have some form. But just getting back, I would definitely not put 11 pages of tables. It interrupts the reader's storyline and train of thought. And I think many journals now allow you to put, for instance, Excel files in the SI for your data, which is extremely helpful. I wrote a review article recently, and we had a whole series of Excel files which people have used to make their own figures, to do their own calculations, and you really want to do what's useful for your readers, and that's my preference. Yeah.
I think you have to remember that any data set that is good that you produce, you want to give it to the reader in a format that they can reuse, and you need to be proud of that. So the easier you make it for the readership to actually use that data, the better. So therefore, any kind of way of putting it on a data server or as an Excel file or whatever, original, whatever file you want, is for people to have access to replot it, reuse it, or whatever.
And just because I want to talk about data too. Again, it is something that is increasingly now being mandated, this data repositories. So I think that's true at Nature now. We're encouraging them, we're not mandating it yet, so it is something you're going to see, I think, increasingly often, and I think it's a really good thing. And I think the reason that's so important is, Liana was saying, even if your conclusions from your paper change in the future because other people go on and do research and they find new data, if your data is solid and they are robust, then other people will always be able to use them, and therefore your paper will remain relevant. If you don't give people access to that data, your conclusions get overwritten because science is moving on, your paper becomes redundant. So I think making your data available is something that you should all be thinking about right from the beginning. And that is definitely not having just PDF files stuck in your SI, because I spend a lot of time copying and pasting those files.
Please don't.
My question has to do with another ethical problem, that conflict of interest with your reviewers and like who's. So, for example, if a review comes back and you know that reviewer quite well, are you supposed to declare that if the reviewer didn't declare a conflict of interest, are you supposed to do that as a writer? And if you're, say, in like the same research group and they're your reviewer, like how close can you be to someone without being?
It's a really good question. So I would say, firstly, when we talked about the option you can suggest reviewers, you can also have an excluded reviewer list. It is unusual that is a very extensive list, but if there's anybody that you have had a kind of personal, professional interaction with that we wouldn't see on your publication record. So for us, generally, we will not ask you to review a paper if you've published with them in the last 5 years, definitely, potentially longer. If it's a PhD supervisor, if it's someone from the kind of close academic family, we would, as editors, try not to send that to review. But if there's something that you think, as I said, in a personal, professional capacity that wouldn't come up in that record, it's really good for you to just let us know about that. And you don't have to go into a lot of detail, you don't have to explain the situation, you can just let the editors know. With regards to if you get a report back and you know the reviewer, the first thing I would ask is that reviewer named on the review? We get a lot of authors who are convinced they know who have reviewed their paper, and it is very rarely the case they are correct. We also get authors who come back and they say, this review is unreasonable, I really want you to send it to this person. They are the only person who can objectively review the paper, and it is often the person who has actually sent the review. So I would just be really careful about assuming the person, the research group, of the person you're getting a review from. Saying that, if they have declared themselves and you think there is a conflict, I would, as an author, contact the editor and have that conversation, but I would say it's rare that that happens.
I'm going to make Gabe talk now in a minute. I just have a question for you guys, actually. How many of you have reviewed a paper? Show of hands. And how many of you have been asked to review a paper and haven't done it? Okay, that's good. So that's, I think, something, especially just coming from this question, that's something maybe useful for you guys as well to think about, is starting to review papers. I think this is a really good introduction for writing your papers and getting yourself published, and also learning about how are these things structured, what does a paper look like when it's submitted, what do I need to know. And so I know that you had some things to say about that, Gabe, so maybe I might hand over to you to get that
And you also
conversation started.
of us how many paper review requests do we get per day?
Yes. Let's start with that. How many paper review requests do you get per day?
Per week.
Me personally.
Or whatever time you.
Yeah. One or two a week.
Same, about 1 or 2 a week, and I can't obviously review 120 papers a year while being editor-in-chief. So I do have to say no often, but I never say no and don't provide an alternative. That's the key. When you become a professional later on, I'll always try to find some junior faculty member somewhere who might be able to review and might help advance your career. I will even ask if a postdoc or senior graduate students will review a paper. I'll talk about reviewing in a little bit, but it's a thankless all-volunteer responsibility. But we all have to do it, otherwise the system fails.
So I think in the same kind of ballpark, but basically the idea is, if you can say yes, especially as a junior person. But at the point where you get multiples per day, and even my out of office message says, if this is about a review, consider this a polite decline. Because I was away for 3 weeks and I got 16 requests because it was a summer. There. So it really depends.
Just on that note, I think it's a really good point to bring up. If someone, for instance myself, sends you a review request and it's your first time or you're unsure about it, editors are just people. You can always kind of email them back and explain that. Again, if you think you read the abstract, we'll send you the abstract, and you go, well, I'm not really sure that I'm equipped. Contact the editor and explain why you're declining, because it might be that there's a method in that paper that isn't in the abstract that I specifically would like your expertise on. So again, I would just say that you should feel very comfortable, and I know a lot of people don't, in contacting editors and talking with us and explaining the situation, and we can figure it out together whether it's appropriate or not.
I think one more question, sort of answer to your question. I mean, editors are not perfect either. We make mistakes by either assigning reviewers or not reading reviews. For example, I have changed the way I do editing. If an editor, if I get a review back and it's not factual, I don't care if it was God who wrote that review, I will not send it on. So I think that's a little bit, I will send it back to God and say, could you please change it, because this is not factual. So we all, we are not perfect, we make mistakes, but I think like Becca said, most of us are sort of human, so talk to us.
Sort of human.
I just have a question about the authorship. So, what is the general rule of acknowledging people who help with laboratory analysis or like field work? And then if you don't include them as an author and just acknowledge them at the end, for example, how do you maintain the relationship where you cooperate in reviews? Like they don't get it, oh, I'm not including them as an author, I'm not going to help you again.
Right, that's an excellent question. I assume this, I'm loud anyway. The idea is that, I mean, acknowledgement's free, right? The acknowledgement section. So in terms of over-acknowledging people, that's never a risk at all. If they did essential lab work for you as a kind of fee for service, if they assisted in the field, that's a completely appropriate place to put their contribution. If they not only assist in the field, but change your entire way you thought of something, and you shared the paper with them for comment, then you would argue that that person should not be in the acknowledgements. They should actually be an author, similar for fundamental lab work, for example. So that's my opinion. I don't know if there's differences.
I think we're on now. I would just say that it's something I would encourage you to start talking about before you start writing the paper. So as soon as, if you have your idea, and we all know you come to a conference, someone has ideas, they have samples that they think, oh, this could contribute to, discuss early on before those collaborations happen. Do they think that's acknowledgements? Do they think that's authorship? How do they think that relationship is going to build? And as the dynamics change, and they do, keep talking about that process again with all of your authors, because all of your authors have to agree. Because if you start adding people to your authorship list, you potentially affect how your co-authors are seen on that paper. So it should be a conversation that you have at every single stage as something changes.
And you also should not be afraid if you are added as an author to a paper where you think you haven't made a contribution well enough. You should read the paper. If you are willing to comment on it, that's fine, but you should say, well, actually, I don't think I've made an intellectual contribution here, and therefore I should not be a co-author. That's also perfectly fine. It's unfortunately not done often enough, because I think what you said is that every author has to read and comment a paper, and very often you see that that's not the case. So both cases, you want to be everybody wants to be an author, but you shouldn't want to be an author just because it sounds good on your CV. Because if then next day I ask you about that paper and you think, paper?
One other thing is in borderline situations where you're not really sure whether a person should be a co-author, what we often do is we'll send a copy of the paper to the potential co-author and say, would you please read this and comment and let us know whether you think you made enough of a contribution to be a co-author. And that tends to make people a little bit more honest, I think, and I think that works out the best. But I also agree with the previous comment. When we get a project started, off the ground, day one, before we even have funding for it, we always talk about authorship, and that may change as time goes on, but it's really good to get that out there, early.
I've got a question I guess relates to receiving reviews that aren't necessarily factual, and also salami slicing. And my first paper, my PhD that I submitted, I was accused of salami slicing as my first paper. I just got the data, so I made a story out of it, which I thought was a good story. And I was accused of that, and I got the review. And I wasn't sure how you would recommend dealing with that, how you would respond. And like my response is to that reviewer, how I should address that comment, which is false, for one.
How did you?
How did I?
Because obviously you've done it already.
Yeah, I
So
wrote,
after getting angry and getting over it.
yeah, which took a few days, I suppose. I wrote to the editor, because you're human. And he was like, thanks for letting me know, I appreciate your comment. But he didn't say anything else other than that. Didn't say, I agree with you, or I don't. I wasn't sure if he thought it was true, that's the thing. Like, as an editor, if you saw that comment, like, this student or this author, I think, is salami slicing, how much, if it's my only paper that I've ever submitted, how do you judge whether or not it's true, I suppose?
So I'm just going to start. I'm not pushing back on you, but as students, you go through and you have advisors who often have funded are funding your support. We have about 10 years, a decade or more of research behind this. And it is sometimes, and I'm imagining your advisor was on the paper, he's an author. So I'm imagining sometimes as reviewers responding to your advisor's past work, not your own work. So you're caught in a funny predicament, right? Because I'm not saying this is the case, but you might inadvertently be part of the salami slicing machine, right, without even knowing about it. That's kind of harsh. Yes. But let's assume you're not, in which case I think you did the right response. You responded back. The author doesn't have to comment on it beyond making a decision based on what that's the input you gave to her or him. So
yeah, okay. I guess I was just sort of taken aback by it. And,
So I suppose, without commenting directly on the situation, because we don't have all the information, we actually wrote an editorial on how to respond to reviewers recently. And I think the main point I would say is, there's a sporting quote that I don't know what it's from, but it's essentially like, play the ball, not the player. So address the comments, not the reviewer. And the reviewers should do the same.
Yeah.
So as an editor, if I read a comment like Anna was saying, that is all just, especially like, this PhD student doesn't know what they're doing, they salami slice. Like, if they haven't given me any evidence for that, as an editor, I probably won't give much weight to their opinion. I'll give it if they have facts.
Yeah.
I might go back to them and say, can you back this up?
Yeah.
And if they can't,
Yeah.
I'd possibly ask them to remove the statement. Similarly, when you're responding, respond with facts, not opinions, not emotions. Just give them the information they need to respond. And also, whether an author responding to reviewers or reviewers reviewing for authors, talk to everyone like you're a professional.
Yeah.
Things often get very emotional, and often the language is far too personal. And that's been quite a surprise to me now, reading reviews every day. Try and take that out. Talk to them as though they are a professional colleague at all times, because that's what they are. So even if they come at you and you feel it's emotional and potentially unprofessional,
Yeah.
I guess like go higher than that. Stick to your kind of roots of professional ability. Professional ability is not a word.
So I'm going to discuss the review, actually the review process a little bit now. How many of you have submitted a paper? So that's quite a few. Keep your hands up. Of those who submitted a paper, keep your hands up if, this includes a panel, if you've had a paper rejected. Yeah? I'm going to be talking, we've all been through it. Senior faculty members who've been around for a while, junior people, we've all had our papers rejected for various reasons, which usually seem very unfair at the time, but often, or at least occasionally, lead to significantly better outcomes in the long term. So I'm going to walk through a little bit to piggyback on Liana's too. After you get angry about the reviews you got, and hopefully before you sent off a screed email to the editors, which will get you won't get you very far in the professional world, how you recover from that. And I think it's really important. First, of course, I've got to plug my journal. Matt, if you want to talk about Geo Health, Matt is here. He's from AGU. The Geo Health Journal is a new kid on the block. It's at the convergence of earth science processes and human health. I know that this field is exploding at AGU. We have a tremendous number of now members of our session. Well, if I could advance it here, that would be nice. Do you know how you advance it on this guy?
It's the arrow.
I did. Oh, it's an advance there. Thank you. It received the 2019 Prose Award for the best new journal in science and medicine, and for one of the top 5 awards in all of publishing, the Excellence in Physical Sciences and Math. That's just saying, please submit to Geo Health. So peer review hasn't been around forever. This is a quote from Albert Einstein, who only had one paper peer reviewed, and he was pissed off when he found out that the editor actually had the nerve to send it out for review. And this was his response. I have no reason to address the, in any case, erroneous comments from your anonymous expert. On the basis of this incident, I prefer to publish the paper elsewhere. We didn't have the nerve to put it out for peer review. So peer review is a relatively new process. However, we've all lived in the world of peer review, right? And so we've all had to navigate it to some point. So what comes back to you? For those people who've submitted papers, there's a set of decisions that come back to you that you have to respond to. And there is the worst decision, which is the reject decision. I've had those. Many of us have had those. And it often comes with some specification. Perhaps it is simply too specialized. For example, some journals like to have general interest papers that have a very wide audience. And perhaps it's too specialized, either too narrow of a focus in terms of its discipline, or too narrow geographically focused, such that it cannot be used significantly in a broad kind of global landscape to advance the science. Sometimes it's simply the wrong journal. You submitted this paper to X journal, the reviewer said, well, that's, or the editor, sometimes the editor gets these papers and they think, and this is often in the editor's purview, when I get a paper as editor-in-chief, I decide whether it goes on to the editorial process. And I believe that, well, our Nature Geoscience colleague is the end member of this, but I simply send some papers back without any review at all, with an explanation of why I'm sending them back. You probably send a lot of papers back.
Over 80%.
Over 80%. I'm under 20%, but that's a different view of the journals, right? Either because of it's too specialized, wrong journal, or it's poor preparation. And those are usually the three reasons why you get a reject. But more often we get a reject after receiving 2 or 3 reviews. And that seems a little bit unfair, probably, to decide the outcome of maybe a year or 2 of your work based on 2 external reviewers. But if you look at my editorial management scheme of how many reviewers I have to ask before I even get 2, my record is 18. That I have to ask 18 reviewers before getting 2. More commonly, it's 10 or so. Is that a standard?
Absolutely.
10-ish. And so you might think, oh, well, how hard could it be to get 3 reviews or 4? It's nearly impossible.
So painful.
Because we have a set amount of time. You know, in my journal, I want to turn papers around in a month. I know Nature Geosciences are the same. A lot of journals, we need to turn papers over quickly. So, another outcome I sometimes give or see is reject and encourage resubmission to that particular journal. And the reason an editor might do this after receiving, is usually almost always after receiving external reviews, is that it's clear that, wow, this is a great idea or a great data set. I wish they had written it differently. And the reviewers and the editor often gets you guidance on how to write something differently so that it is more competitive. And the reason why we say reject and resubmit is like, boy, we'd love to eventually publish this in Geo Health, but it's a pretty long way from getting there, and you have excellent reviews to revise this by. This puts it back in your court. If you really think you can address the reviews and resubmit, then you will simply resubmit and the paper will be treated as a brand new submission, which is sometimes to your advantage. The second is that we sometimes have a ticking clock for revisions, such that if a revision doesn't come back in a month or so, we have to kind of kick it out of the system. We don't have to, but we kind of want, once a paper's in the system, we want to cycle it through pretty quickly. I've had 2 papers recently where I know it's a great paper. It's not going to take a ton to get it to a point where it's pretty solid, but the revisions are so extreme that there's no way they're going to get it done in a month. So I'll just simply say, it's to your benefit to reject this paper now, but please, I really want to see this paper again. And you will get these. I've had those as an author. Neither of these outcomes are necessarily great, but what's next? Well, what's next is usually, if you submit a paper and it's strong, but there are some problems, you'll often get this decision, the major revision. So the topic is good, you need to do the X, Y, and Z based on external reviews and editors' choices. What that really means is now you're in a real conversation with the reviewers and the editor. Because the paper's in the system, you're having a conversation with, well, here's how I address these comments. It's an opportunity to improve your own science. If I get a paper that I sent out for major revision, and I get a paper that's nearly the same sent back to me with these arguments about why all the reviewers and I am wrong, I'm not likely going to advance that paper very far. And major revision usually means there's a lot of serious work to do. It's not I'm changing the format of a table. It's not rewriting a sentence. We all notice as editors when papers come in halfway major revised, that's not good enough. And this leads us to the next thing, and I've had authors get kind of mad at me for this. If I send out a paper, a decision of major revision, and they send it back to me without major revisions, and maybe they send it twice, by giving the decision major revisions doesn't mean I'll necessarily publish it eventually. You have to remember that. It can still be rejected if you end up revising it and it's very clear that in revisions that paper is no longer as strong as you thought it was. And the reviewers say, you know, this paper actually is never going to get to the finish line. That's a painful decision, but that's the one I usually get pushback from authors the most, is eventually I have to say, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to reject this paper for the reasons X, Y, and Z. Finally, there's minor reviews. I occasionally get papers that are sent in fresh, and they're so good that I make the decision minor revision because all of the reviewers say, in which case you're almost there. I will tell you from personal experience, I've never ultimately rejected a paper when there's a minor revisions, nor have I ever had a paper rejected when it's just minor revisions. And those are usually the small changes that need to be made. And so those are all pretty straightforward. In reality, in your life, you might have experiences of what's called mixed reviews. How many, for those who've had a paper reviewed, how many times have you had one reviewer say major revisions or reject and another one say minor revisions? Yeah, it happens, right? It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens. Those are the ones that makes our jobs really, really difficult, because then some of your questions spoke to this earlier. How do I, as editor-in-chief, really analyze who is correct on these reviews? Sometimes they're both correct. I sent it out to one, let's say, detailed geochemist for one particular reason, and then I might send it out to a health expert for another. The detailed geochemist will say, God, the geochemistry is great, minor revision. The health expert might say, science isn't that great, it's not that interesting, the field isn't actually all that interested in that. And so that puts us in a difficult position, but then ultimately it's not the reviewers who are making the decision for us, it's us, unfortunately. Well, fortunately, but we are making the decision for you. But at all times, and this has come up, please remember, it's designed to ensure quality and consistency of that journal and that field. We're all volunteering to do anonymous work, and so please acknowledge that. And to approach revisions and responding specifically to reviewers with that in mind. Always be civil, this has already been said, and this is pretty obvious. Always be civil. I love your point of don't assume you know who the reviewer is who gave you a bad review. Because as an editor, I have had that argument from authors, and I don't have, you can't disclose reviewers, but I'm just thinking, nope, that's the person I sent it to, and they agree. The one that you think will review it favorably, they agree with you. So that's just how to recover from reviews, and I think some of this has come up already, and happy to answer questions, but I'm also going to sit down to answer the questions if there are any, because we've got other expert editors here.
Just a quick story, if I may, following up on what you just said. All right, had a paper kicked back, major revisions, is a serious problem with a data set, is failed to use a method absolutely critical to getting a particular kind of information, and we couldn't recollect the data. So we had to make very clear in our paper that none of the conclusions made in the paper relied on that particular information that could have dropped out of the technique we used. We had to confine our conclusions, make our conclusions a little less interesting in order to save the data set and save the paper. And in that case, it rescued the entire paper.
I think that's a really good point. Being very clear about what assumptions you've made, whether that's in your model parameters that you're choosing or how you're interpreting your data. I think if you're upfront about that, it often makes the process a lot easier, because very often the main thing that happens in review is reviewers are going, well, they've assumed all their stuff. They've now got to go back and re-justify why their conclusions are still valid. So I think don't try and bury anything in a dark cupboard. Put it out there, because people are much more open-minded to kind of trusting you and your science and your data and your interpretation. if they know that you've really considered what are the limitations on that. So I think that's a really good point.
And I think you have to remember that reviewers and editors are also not always right. So not every review saying, oh, you have to do this or this is wrong. If you have a good argument, a documentable argument, to come back to the editor and say, well, actually, in this particular case, the reviewer or the editor is not correct. This is the evidence which I can back it up with. I don't think any editor would say, no, I don't. So as long as your evidence is there and your facts are showing what your data shows, maybe you didn't sell it well in your first version, we didn't understand it well. Ultimately, the reason why a review comes up saying this is not correct is because maybe there was a misunderstanding. But if you have the data and the backing it up, do so, and every editor will consider that.
And just to add to that, no matter how misinformed the reviewer seems and how ridiculous some reviews seem, invariably they always, in the long run, end up in a better paper, because either they pointed out a weakness in the science, or, as has been pointed out, you just didn't do a very good job explaining it to them, so they got misunderstood it.
Just to add to that, I'd say always bear in mind that as an editor, when I'm sending a paper to review, I am sending it to experts in the field. So if experts in the field are confused by what has happened, then we need to rethink how we're communicating our science. So even if you think they're being unreasonable or they're just deliberately not understanding the work, it's very unlikely that it is actually a personal just they couldn't be bothered. They've given up their time, they've tried to understand your work, and maybe they haven't. Then it's a communication problem. And by improving your paper, you're going to make that accessible to so many more people, especially early career scientists. And if your paper is accessible, it's going to be cited and used. So yeah, always bear that in mind.
Can I ask again, how many of you reviewed a paper? Can you raise your hand? So those who reviewed a paper, how long did it take you to review a paper?
Yeah, a couple of days, literally.
Okay. So basically, you see, that's the kind of thing you ask for people at our level, to actually give a couple of days for every paper I'm asked for review. That means the amount of work we put in is actually substantial, because we don't just read your paper, we very often read around it to actually make a proper judgment. But that means sometimes we will get it wrong as a reviewer, as an editor. So prove to us that we are not correct, and then I don't think any problem there.
Guess I'm asking these questions because, of course, we're all human. I'm just wondering, as an author, when you get a paper rejected, how do you actually recover emotionally without, thinking, oh my God, I'm useless as a scientist?
So I'll answer that from my stages of my career. When I was a junior, when I was in my PhD, getting that first paper rejected, it's painful. I mean, it is very painful. There's no question about it. And it took probably about a couple weeks to recover. I'm not saying I cried on a couch for a couple weeks, but it did take a while, because it's also okay. That's a good point. I did do that. No, but because at that stage, I needed to get a job, right? And so papers are important for jobs, usually. And so I needed to do that. And so as a young person, it can be devastating, but that rejected paper, for example, ended up being an accepted paper and published paper somewhere else. And it has more citations than I think any other paper that I've had, largely because it was rejected. This speaks to what Joel said. The paper was substantially improved because of the rejection. In this case, I had submitted to Nature, which has very, very narrow page limitation. Back then, they didn't have an SI, so I had no place to dump all of my good story. Well, the story is in the paper. I had no place to dump the supporting, so it was done. But I was able to fold it into the paper. But as a senior person, seeing my students' papers rejected, first of all, that's almost as devastating for me as that very first paper, because that means I did a terrible job. And so I do the same thing. Science does involve some of these things, and you need to get pissed off for a while and think everyone in the review process is an idiot. Step back and realize, well, actually, they're probably not, and can I salvage this? I've never had a rejected paper be thrown in the dustbin, ever, because at least the core, right? At least the core science. My story sometimes is wrong. My geochemistry, to speak to your point, is I make sure that's not wrong. So you can always reshape that. Sorry, I went on a long time with that one.
I would just maybe add, once you've recovered, it can be worthwhile, I think, to go back and analyze potentially why it was rejected, especially if it's rejected before review, and to think about, was it because you were maybe going to the wrong type of journal? If there was a page limit issue, it's because you couldn't tell your whole story. Is it because the scope of the journal didn't fit? Because I think a lot of the things I reject, and honestly, before I took the job 2 years ago, I hadn't factored in how much of my job would be rejecting people. And that is something I take very seriously, because we understand what these papers mean. And pretty much every single day, I spend rejecting people's work, and I take that very seriously. But a lot of it is because they've submitted a paper to the journal that isn't actually appropriate. And that's not a problem, that's what I'm here to do, but it means that if you want to save yourself that, actually being very realistic with yourself about what your paper is contributing, who your audience is, if you have open access requirements, all those kind of things, find out the journal that's most appropriate for your work, and that will increase your chances of not having to, increase your chances of getting a paper through the system, decrease your chances of getting rejected.
I think the most important thing is to not give up. We all had rejections. It's part of life, not just in paper publishing, right? But don't give up. Just sit back, reflect. What have I done wrong? Because people have given their time, if it went to review it. They've given their time to tell you that something was not quite right. Maybe you didn't explain it well. Maybe your data is sound. Then repackage it or do it differently. But just don't give up, because you've spent a lot of time producing that data.
No, you're taking away. I'll take it.
No, it's too open.
Okay,
I think
I'll
you should
close.
it.
Well, I just.
As another publisher here, I just would like to make a comment. If you rejected and you decide to go to another journal, still respond to the reviewer's comments in your paper. Make the revision. Because as a publisher, I deal with a lot of editors, and one of the things they hate is they send papers out to review, and the same reviewer may end up seeing your paper again. And they'll say, hey, I saw this paper over here and didn't make any changes. Let's take everyone off. So I have to make the revision.
Well, thank you guys. We're running out of time at the moment, unfortunately, but thank you so much for all your questions and for coming. I think to sum up from what we've heard today, the idea is start with a plan. The plan may change, we keep making plans. The same thing, if you get rejected, make a plan of where to go next. And that's really what I think is kind of the message here. But thanks so much for all your questions. Again, speak to any of us if you see us around. Contact editors if you're interested in asking questions. There's lots of information. Everyone is happy to help. Some people are busy. Then again, make a plan and find the next person on your list. But certainly don't give up and keep going. To keep yourself going, there's a few, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's some literature on the table there to the right of the door. Please take that as you go out if you'd like. And thanks very much and good luck, everyone.
Lunch, too.